Hi, thank you for teaching our Hevruta. This week we're looking at pages 35 through 38 in our Hevruta booklet. We are in Parshat Va-Yera, and in this week's Torah portion we have the repeated begging of Moses and Aaron to Pharaoh to let my people go. We also have the first 8 of the 10 plagues. Now, you might want to think about what happens at your own Passover table. What do you talk about when you're having your Seder? You might include some of that in your facilitating conversation with the children. Perhaps thinking about what are modern plagues in today's society. We might not be afflicted with frogs and with locusts, but we are afflicted with other societal woes. And what is our responsibility? How do we respond to that? And how did it happen? Is it God-induced, or is it because of actions that we've taken or have not taken? This week's Torah portion also talks about Pharaoh having a hardened heart. Not everyone realizes that in the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. And then it's the second 5 plagues where God hardens Pharaoh's heart. It's almost as if Pharaoh had hardened his heart so many times that he's unable to allow it to soften after a certain amount of time, even if he wanted to. He's become so accustomed. It's as if when you turn a blind eye to the suffering in your midst, over time, if you do that enough, then you become exercised in turning a blind eye, and maybe nothing will make it possible for you to see and respond. So who are the people in our midst who have hardened hearts? And what do we do to exercise compassion so that our hearts don't become hardened? And what can we do to help those people with hardened hearts to soften those hearts in order to be able to respond to the needs of others? In our Torah portion, God is asked by Moses, "What is your name?" It's a really interesting thing to ask God's name. And God responds, "I am that I am, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh." Now, in the Torah gems, it says that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob never asked for God's name. They were satisfied with what was revealed, but Moses wanted all of Israel to know the nature of God. So that's an interesting thing. What does it mean to think of God's name? Is God's name Adonai, Jesus, Allah, Krishna, Vishnu, Nirvana, Om, Shekhinah? And does it matter what God's name is? It's interesting, God doesn't answer with a pronoun. God says simply, "I am." And what if that was the answer? What if everyone were to just hear that simple, it doesn't matter what you call me, what matters is that you know that I am. Why do I do the things I do? What am I called? What is my nature? All of that is mysterious, but I am. Is that comforting to people? Is that not enough? What is in a name? There's a lot of wonderful discussions one can have about that. There are also theological problems in this week's Torah portion. At the top of page 36, the rabbis ask, why had the time come now to free Israel from bondage? Because God felt that they were becoming accustomed to their burdens. Well, they had been enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. Why only now? How long must we suffer before we're saved, before we're redeemed? Do we believe in waiting for an outside redeemer? At what point do we rise up and take action ourselves? And so where was God? In Holocaust talk, they talk often about the eclipsing of God, that was a time when God was eclipsed from history and couldn't act in history. But is that a way to talk about God? Where is God when bad things happen? Perhaps the answer is partly in God's saying what God's name is, which is just, I am. We can't answer all of those questions. You can't know. You don't have as big a perspective as I do, but I am. Trust that I am. The plagues are all really interesting. One of them especially is hail, because the Torah describes hail as having fire and ice combined. The rabbis think of it almost like ice bombs, that the hail had a spark inside of the ice, a spark of fire, and that these two opposing elements came together to overthrow Egypt. I like to think about one approach to the plagues is that God overturned all of the natural order of the natural world in order to free a people, because freedom is so important. So the first 3 plagues all come from the bottom up. They come from the water, they come from the frogs, they come from the earth lice coming up out of the dust. And then the second set of 3, the pestilence, the boils, and the wild animals all come from this level, from parallel to us. And then the third set all come from the sky. the hail, the darkness, and the locusts. And then the very last plague comes from a place even higher than the sky, from heaven itself. So all of nature was involved. There's, at the bottom of 36, it says, a person should always be pliant like a reed, and let him never be unyielding like the cedar. There's a wonderful little story in the Talmud that talks about how there's a big storm, how there's a cedar tree, which is a big, beautiful, strong tree, and it's next to a blade of grass. And the tree is always teasing the blade of grass because the tree has so much majesty and the grass is so insignificant. And yet, when there's a giant storm, the tree falls, and the blade of grass, because of its pliancy and its flexibility, is able to dance with the winds. And how do we learn to dance with the storms as opposed to being so stubborn that we ultimately fall? There's also, on page 37, it talks about the Hebrew word for conscience is matzpun, which also means north. So our compass, our morality is a compass, and we're supposed to go in a certain direction, a direction of righteousness. We also have the question, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? So how do we strike that balance between helping others and making sure to help ourselves? And there are the famous stories of people on the rowboat. Who do you save? Two people in the desert, you and another person, only enough water for one. Do you save yourself? Do you give it to your friend? How do we strike that balance between how much we do for ourselves and how much we sacrifice for others? And finally, under the mitzvah section, love your neighbor as yourself, which is a really complicated commandment. It is the golden rule, so it's really important. But what does it mean to love others the way you love yourself? How do you love yourself? Some translate it differently. Rabbi Hillel says it should be read, what is hateful to you, don't do to another. Love is really complicated, but hate is very clear. We know what it feels like to be hated. We know what we don't like, so don't do those things to other people. I find it interesting that in the same chapter that says love your neighbor as yourself, there's also the verse that says love the stranger as yourself. So what would our world look like in terms of immigration, in terms of how we see the other, if love the stranger as yourself was the golden rule instead of love your neighbor as yourself? So a lot to think about, and I'm jealous. I would love to be involved in each one of your Torah discussions because it's so rich and so meaningful. Thank you so much.